And we discovered in the Ukraine war that if you get involved in a conflict with a country like Russia, and this is true of China as well, you need a robust industrial base to produce the weaponry to wage that war. One of the advantages that the Russians have over the Ukrainians and even over the Europeans and the Americans is that the Russians have a robust industrial base. So they can produce weaponry over the long term for purposes of waging a protracted conflict. If the United States were to get involved in a war with China, China has a robust industrial base, and it could continue that war for years on end. The United States would be in deep trouble after a few months because, again, it does not have a sufficient industrial base to wage a protracted conventional war.
大家好，这里是华人视角频道。刚才这段话说得相当直白，一场真正可能持续多年的大国常规冲突，比拼的从来不只是舰艇、导弹和先进装备，更是工业体系的深度、产能的韧性以及长期保障能力。面对俄罗斯如此，面对中国同样如此。中国拥有完整而雄厚的工业基础，这不是一句空泛口号，而是支撑国家安全与战略定力的重要底气。而更值得关注的是，这位美国学者并非只是在谈中美实力对比，他把视线投向战术核武器，回顾冷战时期北约的一场兵棋推演，试图说明一个残酷事实：所谓有限核战争很可能从一开始就没有真正的边界。几枚核武器究竟能否达到威慑目的？一旦升级失控，谁又能承担后果？当美国发现自身常规军力和工业基础难以支撑长期消耗时，为何又重新讨论战术核武？这背后折射出的焦虑究竟意味着什么？接下来就让我们走进正片，看看这场关于核威慑、工业实力与大国博弈的深度解析。
I believe what really matters is that we have discovered, as a consequence of the Ukraine war, and especially the Iran war, that our conventional forces are much weaker relative to our principal adversaries than we recognized a few years ago. I think what happened here is that during the unipolar moment, the United States basically allowed its industrial base to wither away. And we discovered in the Ukraine war that if you get involved in a conflict with a country like Russia, and this is true of China as well, you need a robust industrial base to produce the weaponry to wage that war. One of the advantages that the Russians have over the Ukrainians and even over the Europeans and the Americans is that the Russians have a robust industrial base. So they can produce weaponry over the long term for purposes of waging a protracted conflict. If the United States were to get involved in a war with China, China has a robust industrial base, and it could continue that war for years on end. The United States would be in deep trouble after a few months because, again, it does not have a sufficient industrial base to wage a protracted conventional war. And then, of course, if you go to the Iran war, it's very clear that we have run down our stockpile of precious munitions in that conflict. And the end result is that our conventional deterrence has been weakened. You always want to remember that if you're the United States or any other great power, and you're thinking about deterring an adversary, you rely on both conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. And you pay careful attention to what the balance is between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. But we're in a situation now, the United States, where our conventional forces have been greatly weakened as a result of the Iran war and as a result of supplying the Ukrainians with weaponry. And furthermore, as I said, we also realized that we do not have a robust industrial base, which would put us at a disadvantage in a protracted conventional war, right? So given that our conventional deterrence has been weakened, it's hardly surprising that people are now beginning to pay more attention to nuclear deterrence, because that's the way this works. And what's going on, apparently, is that a lot of people seem to think that if we emphasize nuclear deterrence, we should pay careful attention, or maybe special attention is a better way to put it, to tactical nuclear weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons are well suited for use on the battlefield. If you get involved in a war, whether it's in Europe or in East Asia, and you don't feel that you have sufficient conventional forces, you can fight that war with tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think this is true. I think this kind of thinking is misguided, and I'd like to make the case for why I think that's the case. And the best way to do it is to go back to the 1950s, which is a period where we emphasized employing tactical nuclear weapons, and talk about our experience in the 1950s, and to focus laser-like on a particular operation that took place. This was a war game called Carte Blanche that took place in June of 1955. It ran from June 20th, 1955 to June 28th, 1955. Talk about Carte Blanche. But before I get to Carte Blanche, I just want to paint a broad stroke picture of how we thought about deterrence in Europe in the 1950s. The United States and its allies, of course, were interested in deterring the Soviet Union. And when you talk about deterrence, it's important to understand that you also have to be concerned with warfighting, because deterrence might not work. Deterrence might fail. And if deterrence fails, then you have to fight a war. So the United States throughout the 1950s thought long and hard about how to deter the Soviets from attacking into Western Europe, and should deterrence fail, how to fight a war against the Soviet Union. Now, the problem that the Americans faced from their perspective was that the Soviet Union had a formidable conventional army. Remember, the Soviet Union played the principal role in defeating the Wehrmacht in World War II. So throughout the 1950s, most Western defense experts or Western policymakers viewed the Soviet military, and especially the Soviet army, as a formidable force. Furthermore, it's very important to understand that West Germany, which eventually became a key player in the NATO alliance, did not become a member of NATO until 1955, and it did not begin rearming until 1955. So from the period from 1950 to 1955, there was, in effect, no German army. Furthermore, the French were busy fighting against the Vietnamese in Indochina. You remember the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which put an end to the French position in Vietnam, took place in 1954. So France was distracted in a very important way. There was no German military of any consequence. And the United States had limited forces in Europe, limited conventional forces. So what we decided to do in the 1950s was to deploy large numbers of tactical nuclear weapons to Europe and rely heavily on tactical nuclear weapons, not only for deterrence purposes, not only to deter a Soviet conventional attack, but for warfighting purposes as well. And by the way, this is why the United States has never had a no first use policy. The United States has never had a no first use policy because it has always understood that it might have to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation if it was losing a conventional war against the Soviet Union. So in the 1950s, when NATO conventional forces were not especially strong, and the Soviet Union presented a formidable threat, we believed that if deterrence failed and the Soviets were to attack, we would have to turn to nuclear weapons very quickly, if not immediately. Right? So it's just very important to understand that tactical nuclear weapons were seen for much of the 1950s as a magic weapon. Now, what happened to throw cold water on this whole line of thinking was a war game that was run in mid-June 1955. This is called Carte Blanche. And we hypothesized a situation where the Soviets would attack with conventional forces. We would use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, in response. And of course, the Soviets would use nuclear weapons of their own. Now, what happened in this war game? Basically, about 3,000 NATO aircraft from 11 different countries were employed in the war game. And about, I'd say, 335 nuclear weapons were employed. The usual range is 335 to 355. That's how many tactical nuclear weapons were employed in this war game.
回看这一期，真正值得我们警惕的，并不是某一种核武器的名称，也不是某一枚导弹的射程，而是一个在战略讨论中反复出现，却常常被有意无意淡化的问题。当一个国家的常规军力不足时，核武器究竟能不能成为填补缺口的工具？米尔斯海默给出的答案非常明确，核武器可以用于威慑，可以让对手相信你有决心承担风险，也有能力把局势推向更危险的方向，但这并不等于核武器适合用来打一场真正的战争，更不等于所谓的战术核武器就能把核战争控制在一个有限局部、可管理的范围之内。这一区分非常重要，因为在现实的政治语言里，战术核武器听起来似乎比战略核武器更小、更精准、更容易控制。它好像只是战场上的一种特殊弹药，只要选择合适的目标，控制使用数量，就能达到打击军事目标、迫使对手后退的目的。但核爆炸带来的破坏从来不只停留在地图上的一个坐标点，它会造成人员伤亡、基础设施崩溃、社会秩序失控，也会改变对手对战争性质的判断。一旦核武器真正被使用，最危险的变化往往不是第一枚核弹本身，而是双方对下一步行动的猜疑。对手会担心你是不是准备继续升级，你也会担心对手是不是准备报复。原本想通过一次有限打击传递信号，最后却可能变成一连串相互试探、相互加码的行动。所谓有限核战争，最难的地方从来不是按下按钮，而是按下之后，谁能保证所有人都愿意停手？谁又能保证每个指挥系统、每条通信链路、每名现场指挥官都准确理解对方的意图？20世纪50年代的历史已经给出了一个极其沉重的提醒。当时北约面对强大的苏联常规军力，而美国及其欧洲盟友的常规力量并不充足，于是把大量战术核武器部署到欧洲，并设想在必要时用核武器弥补常规军力的不足。这样的思路在纸面上似乎能够形成威慑，可是到了 Carte Blanche 兵棋推演中，当数百枚核武器被投入西德战场，结果不是一个可以被核武器拯救的欧洲，而是一个被核战争摧毁的德国。推演中的死亡和伤亡数字当然只是模拟结果，却正因为它是模拟，才更加说明问题。决策者可以在地图上移动部队，可以把核打击标注为有限，也可以用不同颜色表示战场和目标。可一旦这些符号换成真实的人口、城市、医院、交通线和工业设施，所谓有限就很可能只剩下纸面上的说法。 为了保卫一个国家，最后却把这个国家变成无法正常运转的废墟，这不是胜利，也不是有效的防御。更值得注意的是，北约后来并没有简单的因为战术核武器存在，就认定它能够解决所有问题。相反，随着研究不断深入，人们逐渐认识到，核武器无法替代强大的常规军力。北约一方面继续保留核威慑，把核力量放在最后一道防线的位置，另一方面则重新建设常规部队，强化工业能力，提升长期作战和持续补充武器装备的能力。这个转变背后的逻辑十分朴素，真正稳定的安全不应该建立在每一次危机都把世界推向核毁灭的边缘之上。这也正是今天这期内容与现实世界之间最直接的联系。乌克兰战争以及其他地区的冲突都暴露出一个事实，那就是现代战争不仅比拼高科技武器，也比拼工业基础、弹药产量、后勤体系、人员训练、盟友协调和长期承受压力的能力。如果一个国家发现自己的常规军力被削弱，军工生产无法跟上，弹药库存不断下降，却试图用更多核威慑来弥补这一切，那么它实际上不是解决了安全困境，而是把更多压力转移到了核门槛上。常规力量越薄弱，核武器在战略计算中的位置就越靠前，核武器越靠前，危机中的误判空间就越大。对手可能认为你更容易首先使用核武器，你也可能认为只有展示更强硬的姿态才能重新建立威慑。双方都想通过风险来迫使对方退让，却可能因为风险过高，最终失去控制局势的能力。这种逻辑听起来冷静，实际上却是极其危险的赌博。因此，今天讨论核武器不能只盯着核弹数量、爆炸当量和运载平台，也不能把战术两个字理解成低风险。真正应该关注的是一个国家有没有足够可靠的常规防御能力，有没有足够稳固的工业基础，有没有清晰而可信的危机沟通机制，更有没有在面对冲突时保留退路的政治意愿。核威慑的作用是让战争尽可能不要发生。如果把核武器当成赢得战争的常规工具，那就意味着已经走进了最危险的误区。从更大的角度看，这期内容还提醒我们，强国地位并不只是由核武器数量决定。一个国家想要保持安全和影响力，必须让自己的经济、工业、科技、军队和政治决策彼此配合。只依赖少数高破坏力武器，无法替代完整的国家能力；只依靠威胁升级，也无法消除长期积累的战略弱点。真正成熟的战略，不是不断提高赌注，而是在拥有足够力量的同时，尽可能降低误判和失控的概率。核时代最大的悖论就在这里，核武器越强，越不能轻易使用，越不能轻易使用，就越应该把它放在威慑的背景位置，而不是推到战场最前沿。人类至今没有经历过全面核战争，并不代表核战争有规律可循，而恰恰说明我们缺乏真正的经验。没有人能够保证危机只升级一小步，也没有人能够准确预言当第一道红线被突破之后，下一道红线会在哪里。所以面对今天越来越复杂的国际局势，我们需要保持清醒，既不能低估核威慑的危险，也不能把任何一方的强硬表态简单理解成必然会开战。既要看到大国竞争背后的军事压力，也要看到工业衰退、战略误判和沟通失灵可能带来的连锁后果。理解这些问题不是为了制造恐慌，而是为了明白和平究竟有多脆弱，克制又究竟有多重要。对于这期节目提出的观点，您怎么看？战术核武器究竟是更灵活的威慑手段，还是把世界推向失控边缘的危险工具？在常规军力不足的情况下，一个国家应该优先强化军工和常规防御，还是应该进一步依赖核力量？欢迎把您的看法留在评论区，也欢迎点赞订阅。继续收看更多精彩视频。